Jesus of Nazareth lived at a very specific turning point in ancient history. His lifetime, roughly from 4 to 6 BCE to 30 to 33 CE, sits squarely inside the rule of two Roman emperors, Augustus at his birth and Tiberius during his public ministry. By the time Jesus was born, Judea was no longer an independent kingdom of the Davidic line. For nearly 100 years before Jesus' birth, the region had been unstable, with civil conflicts, rival religious groups fighting for control, and powerful foreign rulers interfering. This period ended when the Roman general Pompey marched into Jerusalem in 63 BCE and placed the region under Roman oversight. What followed was a gradual tightening of Roman control, first through client kings and then later through direct rule. Before Roman power reached the region, Judea had experienced a rare period of independence under the Hasmonean dynasty. This era began in the 2nd century BCE after the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucid Empire. What had started as a fight for religious freedom gradually transformed into a full political state. Judea expanded its borders, annexed surrounding regions, and for a time appeared to have revived the old ideal of a sovereign Jewish kingdom. But the Hasmonean period was never stable. As the dynasty grew more powerful, it also grew more divided. Internal disputes began to dominate its final decades. Religious authority and political authority fused in ways that created tension. High priests became kings, factions multiplied, and rival groups such as Pharisees, Sadducees, and others competed for influence. By the 60s BCE, Judea had fractured into competing camps, and its leaders began seeking foreign allies to boost their own claims. It was during this internal collapse that Rome entered the picture. In 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey Magnus intervened in the Hasmonean Civil War between Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. Both sides invited Rome to arbitrate, but Roman arbitration came at a cost. Pompey marched into Jerusalem, ended the civil war, and effectively turned Judea into a Roman client state. The independence won in the Maccabean revolt was gone, and from this point on, Judea's fate would depend on the political decisions of Rome. Over the next several decades, Judea's status shifted gradually. Initially, it retained its kings, but Rome had the final say. Taxation began to flow toward Rome, military oversight increased. Roman officials judged how useful the region was for their empire. And as tensions in Judea kept growing, Rome tightened its control more and more with each passing decade.
The most decisive change came with the rise of Herod the Great. Rome needed a reliable client king, someone who would provide stability and keep the region quiet. Herod, ambitious and politically skilled, used the Roman civil wars to his advantage. He supported the right factions at the right time, and in 40 BCE, the Roman Senate declared him King of the Jews. He secured the throne by force in 37 BCE. Herod's reign marked a new era. He reshaped the land through extensive building programs such as fortresses, cities, palaces, and the monumental expansion of the Jerusalem Temple. But he paid for these projects by taxing people heavily, and he kept control through constant monitoring, informers, and harsh punishment of anyone who opposed him. The prosperity he created reached mostly the upper classes, while ordinary people lived under financial strain and political anxiety. After his death in 4 BCE, his kingdom was divided among his sons, but misrule and unrest led Rome to place Judea under direct Roman administration by 6 CE. From that point onward, Judea became a Roman province, governed by prefects and later by procurators. This brought its own set of pressures: Roman taxation, military presence, cultural intrusion, and interference in high priestly appointments. Some groups adapted and cooperated, while others resisted quietly. A few prepared for open revolt. Roman rule continued for decades, but the tensions never fully subsided. By the mid-1st century CE, resentment reached a critical point. The revolt of 66 to 70 CE brought everything to the surface: political corruption, Roman brutality, factional fighting within Jerusalem, and apocalyptic expectations. The Roman response was overwhelming. By 70 CE, the temple was destroyed and Judea was shattered, but the Roman control did not end there. Another major revolt, the Bar Kokhba rebellion of 132 to 135 CE, led to even harsher consequences. Judea was renamed Syria Palestina, Jews were expelled from Jerusalem, and the last remnants of political autonomy disappeared. From then onward, the land remained under Roman and later under Byzantine rule for centuries. So this is the historical setting into which Jesus was born.
The precise year of Jesus' birth has long been the subject of scholarly discussion. The New Testament does not provide a direct date, and the sources available offer clues rather than certainties. Matthew's Gospel places the birth during the reign of Herod the Great, who died in 4 BCE, while Luke links it to a Roman census under Quirinius, dated to 6 CE. These details do not align perfectly, leading historians to examine the broader historical context. Most scholars agree that the earlier date, somewhere between 6 and 4 BCE, fits best with the political and historical framework. This period matches Herod's final years, aligns with Josephus' chronology, and corresponds to the overall timeline of Jesus' later activity under Pontius Pilate. Although the exact year cannot be determined with full precision, the consensus places Jesus' birth firmly within the closing years of Herod's reign. Whatever the precise date may be, there is no real debate about the political context. Jesus was born when Herod the Great ruled Judea under Roman authority. The rise of Herod the Great cannot be understood without looking at the political chaos of late Hasmonean Judea and the changes happening across the Roman world. By the mid-1st century BCE, Judea's politics had fallen apart. The Hasmonean dynasty, once strong after the Maccabean revolt, was now trapped in family feuds, priestly rivalries, and struggles for the throne. Two brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, each supported by different noble and priestly groups, fought bitterly for control of Jerusalem. Their conflict weakened Judea so badly that foreign intervention became almost certain. And amid this turmoil rose Antipater, an Idumean court official whose real influence was greater than his title suggested. His family, converted to Judaism generations earlier, they were not old nobility, but skilled administrators who knew how to survive political crises. Antipater backed Hyrcanus II and became a key link between Judea and the expanding power of Rome. His political sense proved crucial when Pompey entered the region in 63 BCE to settle the Hasmonean dispute. When Pompey entered the Holy of Holies, an act shocking to Jewish beliefs, the political landscape of Judea changed irreversibly. Rome did not annex the region fully, but it took charge of foreign affairs, taxation, and security. In this new system, Antipater became the most important local leader. He handled daily governance while cooperating closely with the Roman authorities. His son, Herod, began his career in this environment. He grew up with energy, ambition, and a clear understanding that Judea's future now depended on Rome. The political world changed again after Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE. The Roman civil wars created an atmosphere of uncertainty, but for ambitious men like Herod, they also created opportunities. Antipater had supported Caesar's faction early, which gave him privileges for Judea. After Antipater's death, Herod and his brother Phasael inherited his political network. The Romans, recognizing Herod's effectiveness, appointed him governor of Galilee. But Judea remained unstable. Local rivals resented Herod's rise, and the Hasmonean cause was not entirely extinguished. In 40 BCE, the Parthians invaded the region during Rome's internal turmoil. They restored a Hasmonean claimant, Antigonus, to the throne. Herod fled, first to Petra, then to Alexandria, and finally to Rome. Rather than diminishing him, this exile placed him at the center of Roman politics at precisely the right moment.
In Rome, Herod presented himself as the one man capable of restoring order to a region Rome could not afford to lose. Antony and Octavian, the rivals in many respects, agreed on the need for a dependable, strong man in Judea. In a decisive move, the Roman Senate proclaimed Herod King of the Jews. The title was entirely Roman in origin. It was an instrument of imperial policy, not an expression of local acceptance. Herod then returned to the east with Roman troops and fought a multi-year campaign to retake his kingdom. In 37 BCE, he captured Jerusalem. Then he executed Antigonus, ending the last serious Hasmonean claim to power. This victory marked the beginning of Herod's reign, but it also highlighted the source of his legitimacy. He was king because Rome had made him king. To the Romans, Herod was exactly the kind of ruler they desired in a volatile frontier province, efficient, decisive, and unwaveringly loyal to imperial interests. To many of his Jewish subjects, however, his rule remained problematic. His Idumean background made some people doubt whether he should be king.
His close ties to Rome also led many to see him as a ruler placed over them by foreigners. And although his building projects, especially the temple expansion, won praise, his strict rule, heavy taxes, and constant surveillance created ongoing resentment. Thus, by the time Jesus was born, Herod's kingdom was a paradox, outwardly stable and architecturally transformed, yet internally strained and politically fragile.
Many Jews in Judea never liked Herod, mainly because he had taken the throne by pushing aside the Hasmonean dynasty, which had been the last native Jewish ruling family. The Hasmoneans had led the Maccabean revolt, restored the temple, and created a Jewish kingdom, so removing them was not just a political change but felt like a betrayal of national dignity. This resentment was compounded by Herod's Idumean background. Although his family had been integrated into Judaism for several generations, older Judean families saw the Idumeans as late converts, not natural custodians of the Davidic or priestly traditions. The fact that Herod married into the Hasmonean line did little to soften these attitudes. If anything, his subsequent execution of multiple Hasmonean relatives only reinforced the perception that he had destroyed the old dynasty and replaced it with a foreign-backed regime. Yet this internal hostility was not universal. Many Jews living outside Judea, especially those living under Roman law in cities like Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome itself, viewed Herod differently. From their vantage point, Herod's power at the Roman court served as a protective shield. His close ties to influential Roman circles gave him leverage to advocate for Jewish religious rights abroad. When Jewish communities in places like Asia Minor or Cyrene asked Rome for help, whether to secure legal rights, avoid taking part in emperor worship, or protect their traditional customs, Herod often stepped in, and his influence with Roman leaders usually made the difference. Thus we have the paradox. The very man who was suspect or resented in Jerusalem could be regarded as a vital patron in Rome. Distance softened his image. His cruelty, palace intrigues, and heavy taxation were realities for his subjects at home, but these were largely invisible to Jews living far away. What they saw instead was a king with extraordinary access to the centers of power, a man capable of navigating the imperial bureaucracy on their behalf.
Rome's relationship with Herod followed a common pattern used across the eastern parts of the empire. Instead of ruling every territory directly, Rome often appointed client kings to manage border regions, deal with unrest, and govern people with their own traditions. Herod's kingdom was one link in a long chain of such client states across Syria, Nabatea, and Armenia. Under this system, Herod had a good amount of freedom in local affairs. He could collect taxes, reorganize cities, appoint officials, and even run his own army. But this freedom had limits. His authority always depended on Rome's approval, and he had almost no real independence in foreign policy. He could not start wars, expand territory, negotiate with other powers, or change major administrative policies without the Romans agreeing first. In areas that Rome considered important, like security, taxes, relations with Nabatea and Parthia, or protecting major travel and pilgrimage routes, Herod had very little control. One wrong move could bring Roman intervention, criticism from Roman leaders, or even removal from the throne. This is why Herod constantly worked to stay in Augustus's favor and built strong ties with influential Romans. His position relied on their support. The result was a mixed kind of power. Herod had great authority inside Judea, but he remained fully dependent on Rome. Rome's interests always came first.
While Rome tightly controlled Herod's actions in foreign affairs, it placed almost no limits on how he ruled inside Judea. In domestic matters, Herod held more direct power than any earlier Jewish ruler. His government depended on a strong network of informants, a loyal bodyguard, and an organized bureaucracy that could carry out his orders quickly and effectively. And Herod was never hesitant to use these tools. Herod systematically destroyed every figure who might challenge his authority, including multiple members of the Hasmonean family, the elderly Hyrcanus II, his beloved but politically dangerous wife Mariamne, and even his own sons when he suspected disloyalty. He regarded political rivals as existential threats. His ambitious building programs, fortresses, palaces, cities, and especially the reconstruction of the Jerusalem Temple, brought employment in monumental architecture, but they also required immense taxation. The burden fell most heavily on rural populations.
Herod did not allow any kind of opposition. If a group showed even a hint of nationalist feeling, whether it came from nobles, surviving Hasmoneans, or popular teachers, he reacted quickly and harshly. The memory of the Hasmonean revolt was still strong, and Herod was determined that nothing like it would ever happen again. Although he expanded the temple magnificently, he also interfered directly in the high priesthood, appointing and removing high priests at will. For many Jews, this represented an intolerable level of royal intrusion into sacred institutions. Yet Herod was not irreligious, nor did he seek to undermine Judaism itself. He observed the law, avoided placing idolatrous images in Jerusalem, and made sure his actions did not openly violate Jewish commandments. His rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple was one of the grandest religious projects of antiquity, a structure so impressive that even later rabbis who despised Herod admitted its beauty. Still, Herod's court culture made many Jews uncomfortable. His palaces, such as the Herodium and Masada, were designed in Roman style. His intellectual circle included Greek philosophers, Roman guests, and foreign advisors. His taste for luxury and spectacle gave his court a distinctly non-Jewish tone. And most controversially, Herod aligned himself completely with Roman imperial ideology. In regions outside the Jewish heartland, where Jewish sensitivity to idolatry was lower, he introduced practices that were unthinkable in Jerusalem. The clearest example was his establishment of imperial cult temples dedicated to Augustus. In Samaria, he rebuilt the old city and renamed it Sebaste, the Greek equivalent of Augustus. He erected a major temple to Augustus on the Acropolis, blending Hellenistic architecture with Roman imperial symbolism. Caesarea Maritima, his greatest port city, was named in honor of Caesar. At its harbor entrance, he built a temple dedicated jointly to Roma and Augustus. It was intentionally placed where all maritime traders and Roman officials could see Judea announcing its loyalty to Rome. These projects made perfect political sense to Rome, but in Jewish memory, they solidified the view that Herod was more devoted to imperial propaganda than to Israel's traditions. So even though Herod outwardly kept Jewish law, the Roman style of his court and his loyalty to the empire overshadowed any religious commitment he showed. This is exactly why Jewish tradition remembers him so negatively. In the Talmud, Herod appears as a cruel tyrant, a man of foreign origins, and a betrayer of the Hasmoneans. One famous passage in Jewish tradition refers to him as a slave of the Hasmonean house who rose up and murdered his masters. After Herod's death in 4 BCE, the political unity he had forced upon Judea collapsed almost immediately. Although Herod had left a detailed will, Rome did not automatically accept it. Instead, his surviving sons had to travel to Augustus and plead their cases before the emperor. During this uncertain period, unrest spread across the country. Several different messianic and revolutionary leaders appeared, including Judas son of Hezekiah in Galilee, Simon of Perea, and Athronges the shepherd king, all exploiting the sudden power vacuum and the people's hatred for Herod's oppressive regime. Rome eventually confirmed the division of Herod's realm among 3 of his sons. Archelaus, appointed ethnarch, received the core territories of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. Herod Antipas, made tetrarch, was given Galilee and Perea. Philip, also a tetrarch, received the northeastern districts, Gaulonitis, Trachonitis, Batanea, Auronitis, and parts of Iturea. This tripartite division effectively dismantled the unified kingdom Herod had built and marked the beginning of a more fragmented political landscape in the region. The largest share was given to Archelaus, who was Herod's eldest surviving son. But from the beginning, his administration was marked by brutality and incompetence. In his very first Passover as ruler, Archelaus ordered his troops to attack pilgrims protesting his decisions, leading to the massacre of several thousand worshippers in the temple confines. This single event poisoned his relationship with the Judean population for the rest of his reign. Tensions did not improve over the next decade. Archelaus showed little understanding of Jewish customs. He appointed unsuitable high priests and engaged in open favoritism and corruption. The Samaritans, who generally kept a cautious distance from Judean politics, also found reasons to complain about his misrule and the heavy-handedness of his officials on their territory. Eventually, both Judeans and Samaritans sent delegations to Augustus in Rome, accusing Archelaus of tyranny, mismanagement, and the collapse of public order. In 6 CE, after only 10 years of rule, Augustus lost patience. Archelaus was deposed and exiled to Vienne in Gaul. With his removal, the largest and most politically sensitive part of Herod's former kingdom ceased to be a client kingdom altogether. Rome reorganized the region as a Roman province, placed under the authority of a prefect who, in turn, was subordinate to the governor of Syria. This administrative shift had enormous consequences. It placed Judea directly under Roman law and taxation. Rome soon ordered a census to register the population and its property, the same census that sparked the uprising led by Judas the Galilean. From that point onward, Judea was ruled by a series of Roman governors, one of whom was Pontius Pilate, who governed during the years around Jesus' ministry.
Herod Antipas, who received Galilee and Perea, quickly proved himself a capable and cautious ruler. His foundation of Tiberias on the western shore of the lake and his careful participation in Roman politics allowed his territories to remain comparatively peaceful. Philip, ruling the northeastern territories, Batanea, Trachonitis, Gaulonitis, and Auranitis, maintained an even quieter administration, leaving behind a reputation for justice and stability. These vassal states provided Rome with a buffer zone and ensured that not all of Herod's realm had to be absorbed at once. Within Judea itself, however, the situation changed profoundly. Jerusalem, once the political center of the land, lost its administrative importance. The Romans chose instead to place the provincial headquarters in Caesarea Maritima, the magnificent port city built by Herod in honor of Augustus. Caesarea was thoroughly Roman in design, and it offered both strategic access to the Mediterranean and a population far more aligned with Roman culture. From this point on, governors resided primarily in Caesarea, and the Roman auxiliary garrisons stationed there formed the backbone of provincial control. Even so, Jerusalem could not be ignored. It remained the most densely populated city, the spiritual heart of Judea, and the setting for frequent unrest, particularly during pilgrimage festivals. For this reason, governors regularly traveled to Jerusalem, especially at Passover, bringing with them additional troops to prevent or suppress disturbances. A small but permanent detachment of Roman infantry was also posted in the Antonia fortress, overlooking the temple precinct. Economically, Judea now functioned as a standard Roman province. That meant one thing above all: taxation. Judea was required to pay tribute to Rome, a visible sign that it was no longer sovereign. The Roman tax system depended on periodic censuses, which recorded not only individuals, but also their property, landholdings, slaves, and income sources. These declarations determined each person's tax liability.
Despite the unmistakable weight of Roman control, local Jewish institutions retained considerable autonomy, especially in the areas that mattered most to Jewish religious identity. Rome generally preferred to rule through existing structures whenever possible. In a culturally sensitive and volatile province like Judea, allowing Jews to manage their internal legal and religious affairs was not just a courtesy, it was practical governance. As long as taxes were paid, order was maintained, and loyalty to Rome was not threatened, the Romans allowed Jewish authorities significant room to operate. At the center of Jewish self-government stood the Jerusalem Sanhedrin, the highest legal and religious authority. Traditionally called the Great Court, it met within the temple precinct, underscoring its role as the guardian of sacred law. For Jews throughout the land, the Sanhedrin embodied continuity. It settled legal disputes, interpreted ancestral tradition, and served as the public voice of the nation even under Roman rule. Its authority, however, was not absolute. Rome kept control over capital punishment, especially in cases involving political unrest or threats to order. This followed standard imperial policy. Only Rome could authorize an execution on behalf of the state. Yet the system was not entirely rigid. Prefects sometimes allowed the Sanhedrin to handle capital cases involving internal religious discipline. How much freedom the Sanhedrin had depended largely on the prefect, the nature of the case, and the overall political climate. Even after Judea passed under direct Roman administration in 6 CE, the princes of the Herodian dynasty continued to hold significant influence. Rome regarded the Herodians as a loyal client family. The Herodian princes also maintained close personal links with Rome. Herod's sons regularly sent agents and representatives to the imperial court, just as their father had done. Through these channels, they acted as informal advocates for Jewish interests, especially concerning Jewish communities across the diaspora.
Though they did not speak for Judea itself, which was now under Roman prefects, they remained valuable intermediaries. Among Herod's surviving sons, Herod Antipas stood out for his ambition and administrative skill. Over the decades, he revitalized his domain through urban projects. He rebuilt Sepphoris, turning it into a flourishing administrative center, and later founded his most celebrated city, Tiberias, on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. It is within Herod Antipas's tetrarchy that two of the central figures of early Christianity, John the Baptist and Jesus of Nazareth, lived and carried out most of their activity.
John the Baptist carried out his ministry in a region that sat on the edge of Herod Antipas's authority, the Jordan Valley. By choosing this region and calling people to repentance, John reminded many Jews of earlier prophets who had called the nation back to faithfulness. His message was straightforward. Israel needed to turn away from wrongdoing, renew its loyalty to God, and get ready for a coming act of divine judgment. Crowds came from Judea, Perea, and Galilee to hear him, and the ritual of baptism he administered became a sign of moral and spiritual reawakening. Even though John's message was religious, it had clear political implications. In a society like first-century Judea, moral criticism of leadership was never merely personal. It had implications for stability and legitimacy. And in Antipas's case, the issue was particularly sensitive. Antipas had divorced his first wife, the daughter of the Nabatean king Aretas IV, in order to marry Herodias, who had previously been married to his half-brother Herod Philip. Many Jews saw Antipas's marriage as a clear violation of the laws of the Torah, especially the regulations in Leviticus about marrying a brother's wife while he was still alive. When John spoke out against the union, he was simply saying aloud what many people already believed, and his public criticism made those private objections impossible for Antipas to ignore. For Antipas, a charismatic preacher drawing large crowds was already a potential problem, and when he added direct criticism of his personal conduct, John became a political threat. To neutralize this threat, John was arrested and taken to Machaerus, the strong fortress overlooking the Dead Sea. Holding him there kept him far from the crowds and prevented his preaching from feeding further public excitement. The Gospels add the extra details that led to John's execution, while Josephus offers the political explanation. Antipas acted out of fear that John's movement, if unchecked, might become the center of open unrest. Jesus spent nearly all of his life and ministry within Antipas's tetrarchy. Although Jesus was born in Judea, his social outlook and the crowds that responded to him was the territory ruled by Herod Antipas. After Joseph and Mary returned from Egypt, they settled in Nazareth, a small village in Lower Galilee. This was no accidental choice. Judea under Archelaus was unstable, while Galilee under Antipas was comparatively quiet and better governed. Nazareth itself was a modest place, but it stood only a few kilometers from Sepphoris, Antipas's early administrative center. During Jesus' childhood, Sepphoris was being rebuilt on a grand scale, and so the economic and cultural pull of Sepphoris would have been felt strongly across the region. Galilean villages sold produce there, craftsmen traveled in and out, and taxes were coordinated through Herodian officials stationed near such cities. Jesus therefore grew up on the edge of a Hellenistic urban project, close enough to feel its presence, but far enough to remain rooted in a Jewish village world. When his public ministry began, Jesus relocated his base to the lakeshore, especially Capernaum. This choice makes perfect sense within the geography of Antipas's rule. Capernaum sat on the Via Maris, the major trade route linking Damascus with the Mediterranean coast in Egypt. It was a customs post. Matthew's presence as a tax collector reflects exactly this setting, and it was populated by fishermen, boat builders, farmers, and transport workers who lived under a constant flow of goods, soldiers, and officials. Antipas maintained an administrative interest in the Sea of Galilee, since its fisheries were an important source of revenue. Jesus was therefore operating in a zone of high visibility. From this hub, Jesus moved through the villages around the lake and into the hill country. These were tightly knit communities shaped by local religious teachers, traditional Jewish piety, and agricultural life. Yet they were never isolated. Galilee had a reputation for being socially dynamic, economically active, and culturally mixed. It was not unusual to meet Greek-speaking merchants, Syrian craftsmen, or itinerant preachers moving along the roads. This environment partially explains why Jesus' message spread so rapidly in Galilee even before he approached Jerusalem. Importantly, nearly all of this activity occurred under Herod Antipas, not under direct Roman administration. Antipas was responsible for public order, taxation, and justice in Galilee. His police officers and his appointed officials monitored the region, especially the lake towns. Jesus' growing crowds and his reputation drew Antipas's attention. The Gospels do record that Antipas heard of Jesus and was curious about him, perhaps seeing him at first as another charismatic Galilean figure after John. By the time of Jesus' final days, Antipas was in Jerusalem for Passover and briefly questioned him, though with no real outcome. Jesus' movements occasionally crossed borders into the Decapolis, into Philip's territory north of the lake, or into Phoenician regions, but these were brief excursions. The heart of his mission remained in Antipas's domain, particularly in Galilee, where he formed his disciples, gathered his followers, and proclaimed the arrival of God's kingdom. Even his eventual journey to Jerusalem, which lay under direct Roman rule, was undertaken from a Galilean base. The long and relatively successful reign of Antipas changed abruptly with the death of Emperor Tiberius in 37 CE. The new emperor, Gaius Caligula, shifted political favor within the eastern client kingdoms. Antipas's nephew, Herod Agrippa I, who enjoyed a close friendship with Caligula, began to overshadow him at court. Encouraged by Agrippa's influence, Caligula reassessed the Herodian princes and found Antipas wanting. Antipas was accused, possibly unjustly, of plotting against Rome and maintaining an armed force without permission. In 39 CE, he was stripped of his tetrarchy and exiled to Lugdunum in Gaul, and then his territories were handed over to Agrippa. So this is the end of this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please like this video and subscribe to this channel for more such contents. And thanks for watching.